Yeah, it's going back a little bit, but this is a nice picture about fences and boundaries between sectors. So let's use it again. But just, I mean, this is one of the first schemes I visited in Ethiopia, which is actually a MUS scheme that one of our partner NGOs had built. There's a spring somewhere up the hill. It's feeding this is an irrigation tank partway, near the top of the hill. This feeds down to the community where there was a nice irrigation scheme. There was also some domestic water supply access, some access for livestock, and all this had been integrated. And in fact, next to this irrigation tank, another domestic tap stand had been built, but it just happened never to work from the beginning. So even though this was a MUS scheme in theory, this lady who was far from the domestic water points down the bottom of the hill has to collect water like this, which illustrates, I think, a few of the problems that you can also do these MUS schemes. Even if you do it, even if you attempt it, you can get it wrong as well, or still not be adequate. There's been a lot that's happened in Ethiopia. Just to give us a little bit of background, but Steph mentioned the MUS project, I think, and that was one of the, Ethiopia was one of the countries, and that gave us the chance to do some first research on MUS, and there was also a bit of a learning alliance at mainly local level. Ripple picked that up. Marik and others were specifically involved and did a bit more detailed research. We happened to have the 2008 International Symposium at the MUS Group in Addis. There was also an international symposium in 2003. Then we ourselves do have one ongoing project, which I'm not going to say a lot about, but just I will mention in passing. But the MUS Rain project. So we do have a bit of more action research ongoing. Partly as a result of these efforts and us doing the kind of things we do, MUS did get mentioned in the absolutely key water sector policy, domestic water sector policy, the Universal Access Plan in 2009. There was a mention there. Nothing much happened since in terms of government, but and I'll say something about that as well. As you know, it was one of the studies where we did the scoping study. I think something else I added there is, just as an illustration of the fact that this issue is being picked up by others. This was the topic of a Dutch embassy-supported seminar. They do twice yearly seminars, and they get together a very good group of the sector and that just happened last month. So other people are picking this up. We made some inputs to that. What are the key things in terms of what's happened in Ethiopia? Basically, it's been NGOs who've been picking this up. The same NGO that was involved in the MUS project, the MUS Rain project, and in Ripple largely. Government showing a bit of interest, even putting in their policy, but not necessarily doing anything with this in terms of a model or adjusting their service delivery models to take account of it. So a lack of champions in government especially, but also a real lack of models applied at scale. So lots of interest, but lots of progress, lots of things needed as well, and lots of constraints. I wanted to say a little bit more about the one ongoing action research project that we do have funded at the moment. This is an IRC-led project with partners, Rain, and their interest in rainwater harvesting, Ripple, and HES, this NGO in Ethiopia that's been implementing MUS-type work. Just to say, sort of background, what we're trying to do in this project is the hardest possible environment for doing anything to do with MUS. It's working in some of the very dry areas and working with the kind of techniques that Rain are interested in to access water from these kind of sand rivers that you see in the picture there. So you can access water from the aquifers within these sandy riverbeds. You can get quite a lot, and you can do MUS-type schemes with that. And we're piloting ways to do that. The reason it's challenging is because it's technically hard to find the water in these environments, but they're the low-cost structures that need a lot of replacement. The Capmanex is very high. You need to rebuild these things because the rivers get flooded and the structures get damaged. And you're doing that in a context of community management. So this is a bit similar to, I don't know, something like using rope pumps for community management. You're using a low-cost technology which breaks down all the time. That puts a lot of stresses on the community structure. But we are using wash cost type frameworks to study this in particular. Okay, then just to say a bit about where we are finding some other entry points, and perhaps entry points that have got even more potential to go to scale than what I just mentioned. I think several of you will have heard me talk about CMP in various times. This is it is a service delivery model, one of the 4 in Ethiopia. It's actually touted as the main one for raw water at the moment, being scaled up as that. It's this project where something clever happens to the money, that the money gets sent to communities via the microfinance institutions, that's the MFI. Communities do their own procurement with all the kind of support you need from government. And this has led to higher utilization rates and better support sustainability of mainly point source raw water supply systems, mainly wells with hand pumps, also spring developments as well. Yeah, the government's not cut out by any means, although the money is routed in a different way. There's a lot of effort on building up the local government capacity, the warriors, and their new roles. The difference also is there's a much higher element of private sector development. And this is actually a test case, I suppose, of what Steph's already referred to in the background, of whether when decision-making is more decentralized, there should be more opportunities for MUS, because we know that users can then define what they want to do and the way they want to do it, so they can take account of their local context and do things like this. And that's fine in theory. To be honest, we still don't know to what extent that's actually happened, because we haven't done a proper study of the CMP projects over the past 10 years. This has been going for a number of years. It was called something else. It was called CDF. But it's basically the same thing. It's just now being scaled up under a different name. So we don't know really to what extent MUS has been facilitated in the past by this more decentralized planning, and that would actually be an interesting study to do, because I think that has happened to an extent, but I also think that the warrior, the government still has a key role. The guidelines are still not multisectoral and talking about MUS. So even though the decision making's been decentralized, I suspect there were a number of other things that weren't done to allow or to help facilitate some of these schemes doing things to do with productive uses as well as domestic uses. But this is definitely something that all the partners in CMP are quite keen to explore. And in fact, Arto Suominen, the leader of this project, is one of the main champions, I suppose, for MUS at the moment. The second service delivery model in Ethiopia that we work with a lot, and what Inga spends most of her time working on, is self-supply. And this is just illustrated here. We did a study with Ripple and with UNICEF of these kind of holes in the ground that you see at the bottom of the ladder there, the very poorly unprotected traditional wells or family wells, and ones that are a bit more protected. You see the next well there with an apron and with an oil drum. We've also studied rope pumps, a lot of them generally installed rather badly. This isn't a bad one. And we've also done a specific study during the last year on the uptake of motorized pumps in Ethiopia, and we did a specific study of 50 families in a couple of warriors in one region where there was high uptake of motorized pumping. And what we found was that, well, I'll show an example in a minute, but what we found is that, self-supply, this kind of uptake the initiative to go ahead and dig a hole in the ground, for which you have to pay yourself. You fund the whole costs, and to then upgrade that hole in the ground to something better, which gives you perhaps a safer source of water and a source of water that you can get the water out of the ground faster with a pump. That's driven by productive uses as much as it is driven by access to convenient, safe water for domestic purposes. So they really do go along together. So self-supply is definitely a way of doing MUS. And if we neglect the productive aspects of self-supply too much, we're not going to be successful with our efforts to scale up self-supply. And to an extent, we are actually guilty of that at the moment. We're trying to reach out and get to grips with what the agricultural sector are doing in Ethiopia, but we need to do much more. Just to give an illustration of some of the results where we've compared self-supply with the hand pump, with the communal source. I don't know, can you see those figures at least a little bit? They're a bit fuzzy even on my screen. I think you're muted, I hope. Are you still there?
Yes, we were muted, but the figures are fuzzy.
Okay, all right. So I hope you can at least to an extent see the figures. The important, this is just one of the tables from a report we're producing from our various self-supply studies. The important thing is the bottom two rows, where we've looked at to what extent some of these different sources are being used for watering animals and for irrigation. And there's plenty of variability both between the types of sources, the sort of family wells, the unprotected family wells that I've just shown, the rope pumps, the community sources, but also between the different regions, partly because of real differences and partly because of, I think, because of some of the questions we ask. And you also see on the final column there the mechanized wells, where we did a small study of 50 wells in 2 worridas. And what you see is that as well as being used for, most of these sources being used for all the domestic uses, these kind of sources are important for watering animals and for irrigation, much more so than the community hand pumps where we studied that, because the community hand pumps in Ethiopia tend to be quite distant from the households. They tend to serve quite large numbers of families. You walk a long way to collect a little bit of water from those sources. What works well where we studied family wells is where you have both those sources alongside each other, so you can get a bit of safer drinking water, maybe, because we know a lot about what is safer or not, and we did that in our last seminar, but you can get a little bit of safer water from your community hand pump and more water for all the other things you want to do from your family well. Yeah, I want to say a little bit about this. I think there's only 2 slides left, but this is one about a major effort which is actually trying to take up some of these ideas about MUS. It's a multi-million, $20 million project. Largely DAE has funded, a bit of Canadian money, routing it through UNICEF. It tries to link together WASH and the sort of conventional work that UNICEF does on WASH with MUS and with community-based nutrition, that being a group and an approach in UNICEF that UNICEF also supports, that they want to pull together so that they can have impacts on water and food security, child malnutrition and stunting and so on, and all these kind of things that UNICEF are interested in. So they include both MUS as something they will do, and they include specifically CMP and self-supply as implementation modalities that should facilitate MUS. They also include in that project MUS in schools, lots of school gardens. But there's a real, and this is a project just starting, there's a real lack of clarity as far as I can see on what community MUS models are within this project. They're not well thought out. For example, on how having school gardens might give any outreach into the community and what the model is and the community on MUS. These are not well developed. Another issue is very much is there any government involvement and buy-in to this kind of multi-sectoral collaboration that UNICEF is piloting itself within its own organization? And even that, I think there are limitations yet about, or there's some warning signs, I think, about whether they will achieve that even within UNICEF. So I hope we'll be involved in this project in some way. That's also proving problematic, but Ripple are a major implementer, and if we get the chance, we will follow up and push some of these issues. This is the last slide. Just to pick up on what Steph was saying earlier, I don't see MUS in Ethiopia yet as a service delivery model. There are 4 service delivery models for the sector. MUS fits very well into at least 2 of them. It can fit into the others as well, but it's just at the community level. It's more challenging, harder, and there's more constraints to overcome institutionally. There's a big unmet need at the moment for learning across institutions and organizations on the issue. The kind of work which the MUS group is doing internationally, we really need to be doing within the country, and not just at the federal level, but also at the regional and wider level. That's still a big gap. None of the networks, even though Ripple have picked this up, none of the networks or major platforms are really doing anything substantial with MUS yet, although we see signs that some people are picking it up, and it is like that Dutch meeting I mentioned. This big need is for getting to grips with the agricultural sector, also other sectors like the finance sector. In a sense, we're being nicely forced to do that by the Dutch embassy, because they don't actually fund WASH in Ethiopia anymore, but they do food security, so they quite like the idea of us doing bits of WASH with a food security focus, where obviously MUS fits well. So, but we are a bit being pushed to do that, but everybody else needs to be pushed too, and there's a real big barrier to break down with what's happening in agriculture. So need for a lot more action research. I mentioned the UNICEF project. They want to implement something at scale, but really the models for doing it are very, they're not well thought out yet and not tested. Yeah, I've already made that last point, so I think that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, John. I suggest that we also, in view of the time, we quickly take also Marika and Kurian's presentation, and then we end with an overall description. I think the presentation was quite clear, and there's questions for clarification, but otherwise I'd rather.
I was just noting that, John, you said something about how decentralization contributes to potential from us, because users can define their own service levels that they aspire to. I didn't quite understand what you mean. John, am I needed? What else?
I got the first part of your question, but the end of it, you didn't understand which bit?
I don't understand the link between decentralization and MUS. Maybe you could say a bit more about that.
Okay, well, because MUS, it's not only us who thinks MUS is such a great idea, but lots of people at the local level think this too. So given the chance to make their own choices about the technology or the way their project is developed, we see people will do schemes that build in, that are more multi-purpose than the kind of schemes a designer that's sent to that community will come up with.
Mm.
So in theory, these kind of, anything that involves some participatory planning or the kind of community contracting that's in the CMP should make it easier for communities to put in anything they want to do with livestock, irrigation, and so on.